So, the cross. It's probably the most recognizable symbol in the world, right? But what does it actually mean? I mean, how can one singular event, something that happened 2,000 years ago, really change, well, everything? That's the huge question we're going to tackle today. And it's a massive question. It's something Christians have been wrestling with for centuries. And over time, they've come up with different answers, different ways of explaining it. Think of them as models for understanding what happened at this pivotal moment in history. Okay, so the fancy theological word for all this is atonement. It sounds complicated, but at its core, it just means reconciliation, making things right again. But the how, that's the real mystery. How did Jesus' death actually make things right? And that's where things get super interesting, because that's where these different models really start to go in different directions. So, to really get a handle on these different answers, we're basically going to take a trip through time. We'll look at what the earliest Christians believed, how things changed in the Middle Ages, what the Reformers thought, and where we've landed today. And you'll see pretty quickly that the model you choose, well, it changes everything. It completely shapes how you see God and even how you see yourself. All right, let's jump right in at the beginning. For the first millennium, that's 1,000 years, folks, the main way Christians thought about the cross had nothing to do with a courtroom or legal depths. Nope, it was all about a cosmic battle, a story of victory and deep, profound healing. Yeah, take a look at this timeline. You can see just how consistent this view was for a long time. I mean, for 1,000 years, it was pretty much the same story. And then, bam. Around 1100 AD, something big happens, a major pivot that sends Christian thought down a totally new road. So this dominant early view was called Christus Victor. That's Latin for Christ the Victor. And let me tell you, it's an epic story. It pictures Jesus not as some passive victim, but as this divine warrior who storms the gates of hell, goes deep into enemy territory to take on the powers of sin, death, and evil itself, all to set humanity free. And the way the early church leaders talked about this is just fascinating. Check out this quote from Gregory of Nyssa. He called it a divine mousetrap. How great is that? The idea is that the devil sees the bait, Jesus' humanity, and goes for it, but gets caught on the hook of his divinity. Basically, evil completely overplays its hand and ends up getting defeated by the very thing it tried to crush. Okay, so you have this epic battlefield metaphor, but running right alongside it was something much more personal and honestly beautiful. It's called the restored icon model. Picture this. Humanity was created to be this perfect image or icon of God, like a beautiful painting. But sin comes along and just shatters it, right? So what does God do? Christ, the perfect icon, becomes one of us, entering into our shattered humanity to heal and restore that painting from the inside out. This isn't just about forgiveness, it's about healing our very nature. But then, around the year 1100, the whole story shifts. A brand new way of thinking about the cross starts to take hold, and honestly, it would change the course of Western theology forever. So, a theologian named Anselm of Canterbury comes along, and he basically changes the entire setting of the story. The central metaphor is no longer a battlefield or a hospital. Instead, we're in a feudal courtroom. And suddenly the main problem isn't that humanity is sick or held captive. No, the problem is now a legal one. We owe a massive debt to God. This became known as the satisfaction theory. And here's the core idea. Our sin isn't just a mistake, it's an offense against God's infinite honor. And because we're finite beings, there's literally no way we could ever pay back an infinite debt. It's impossible. So according to Anselm, the only solution was for a God-man, Jesus, to pay it for us. Only he could offer a payment or a satisfaction big enough to restore God's honor and balance the scales of justice. Now, this legal way of thinking, it laid the foundation for what was coming next. Fast forward a few hundred years to the Protestant Reformation. Thinkers like John Calvin took Anselm's courtroom idea and, well, they took it to the next level. They developed it into what is probably the most dominant view of the cross in the Western world today. And that brings us to Penal Substitutionary Atonement, often just called PSA. With this model, the legal idea gets even sharper. It's not just about paying a debt of honor anymore, it's about punishment. The argument goes like this. Christ didn't just pay what we owed, he took the actual punishment that we deserved. He stood in our place and endured God's righteous anger, his wrath against sin. And only by doing that could God's justice be satisfied, allowing him to forgive us. Okay, so this is a huge fork in the road, right? You have these two totally distinct paths. On one side, you've got the ancient view of victory and healing. On the other, you have this later, legal view of debt and punishment. And let me tell you, these two paths lead to two very different pictures of who God is, what sin is, and what salvation is all about.
This table really lays out the difference, doesn't it? It boils down to this. Is salvation basically a legal transaction, like a judge slamming down a gavel and declaring you not guilty? Or is it something deeper, a personal transformation that actually heals you from the inside out and sets you free? The way you answer that question has massive implications for your entire life.
And it's exactly because of those implications that, especially in recent years, a lot of theologians have started to raise some serious questions about penal substitution. They're asking things like, wait a minute, does this paint a picture of God who's more like a cosmic accountant focused on transactions and punishment? Or does this encourage a relationship with God that's based on fear instead of love? This quote from Steve Chalk, wow. It's pretty provocative, but it gets right to the heart of the moral objection that a lot of people have with this view. He calls it cosmic child abuse. And his point is to question the image of a father who needs to punish his innocent son to satisfy his own anger. Critics argue that this sounds less like a perfectly loving God and more like a deeply troubled family dynamic. So, facing these tough questions, a lot of people are starting to look back, to rediscover the power and the beauty of those much older models. They're returning to that vision of a victorious God who doesn't come to punish, but to rescue, heal, and restore. And this brings us back to this incredible idea from the early church called Theosis. Theosis is the idea that salvation is so much more than just having your sins wiped away. The goal is to be transformed, to actually become more like Christ and participate in the very life of God. As the great Athanasius put it, he was made man that we might be made God. Just let that sink in for a second. So when you look through this restorative lens, everything looks different. The cross isn't a courtroom, it's more like God performing divine surgery on a sick humanity. Salvation isn't a one-time transaction. It's a lifelong process of becoming whole. And maybe most importantly, it gives us a God who isn't standing off to the side, demanding payment. Instead, this is a God who dives right into our suffering with us, to redeem it from the inside out. So in the end, it really comes down to this. The model of the cross you lean into shapes, well, pretty much everything. What does the cross reveal? Is it a courtroom where a legal problem gets a neat and tidy solution? Or is it a clinic, a divine hospital where a deep, pervasive sickness is finally healed? How you answer that question will define not just your theology, but your whole understanding of God and what it truly means to be human.